Alan came with a strong reputation in environmental education and sustainability. However, just as a little bit of an aside, to come to a faculty of this size and to travel halfway around the world and to try and come to grips with things, I think there's a challenge in that. Alan's come here, and not only has he exerted his academic intellect in the work of the faculty around his cognate field, he also accepted the role as Associate Dean Education. Now, I hear you say, Associate Dean Education, I wonder what that means. Alan looked a lot younger when he arrived. Actually, what Alan has done in the time that he's been here has to do all of the things that matter in a faculty like this in terms of professorial leadership. He's been able to exert authority over his cognate field. He's been able to develop and draw in ideas, issues and people around the work of his field, which he'll be speaking about tonight. More importantly, as a leader in the faculty, he's also done a remarkable amount in the education domain of the faculty, in helping us to be restructured, reorganised, thoughtfully working together and bringing in a whole bunch of things that in education you would think ought to be de rigueur. Working in teams, collaborating, cooperating, challenging curriculum, offering new ways of thinking about teaching and learning, and pushing the boundaries of what we do and taking us out of our comfort zone. Alan has done that in a very inclusive, thoughtful and powerful way. He's done that across the faculty as a leader in education. And no pressure, Alan, that's what we're expecting to see tonight in your lecture. Welcome.
Thank you. So how was the lecture? Well, I think it was good. You don't sound very sure. Well, I'm not quite sure the point Alan was trying to make. That sounds like the Alan I know. You mean he didn't talk very clearly, he had too much to say, or he didn't have enough to say? Well, something got lost in the message, I think. Wasn't that the point? You mean he used PowerPoint? Yes, he used PowerPoint, but the points weren't very powerful. You mean the points didn't have any strength, or their strength was in their weakness? I might need to think about this. Did you take any notes? Well, he gave us a handout. And what did you make of the handout? Well, he asked all these questions. And he didn't answer any of them. You mean he didn't answer them verbally? He had a lot of pictures. Did you pay attention to the pictures? No, I don't think I did. Perhaps that was the point. First things, it's November. If you haven't donated yet, it's a very worthwhile cause, please do. Please note that number at the bottom and you can contribute. Otherwise, I will look something like this very, very soon. Where to start? Well, John has very kindly summarised all sorts of good things about the work I've been doing over the last few years. But really, the job I applied for was not the job I came and did. If John remembers, I applied to be a campus dean, at Peninsula, and I'm so glad I don't do that job. I appreciate the shift in direction. But actually the direction I start from is around these kinds of things. On the sheet of paper in front of you, I've summarised a couple of things which I hope you can take away from this lecture. I know that in 3 hours' time you will forget pretty much every single thing I've said. I also know that your attention span means that in about 20 minutes' time most of you will be restless and will wish that this hour-long lecture changed style. I'm also aware that with all of this kind of stuff here, it may not be what you're familiar with, so I might have to work really, really hard. It's also 6 p.m. It's also a time where someone with an English accent probably wishes they weren't being reminded of cricket scores. And there might be some other things which I need to pick up on in order to draw you into the kind of discussion. David Orr is the fellow in the left-hand corner. Top right is one of my favourite authors, Wendell Berry. We'll see how these perhaps connect as we go through. This is a Faculty of Education. One of the things that I am very aware of here is that literacy is a huge focus. And one of the things which happens with literacy being such a huge focus is that we get caught up with using the power of literacy to justify all sorts of things. There is now critical literacy, scientific literacy, audio literacies, all sorts of different forms of literacy. Perhaps, though, we need to start with thinking about what it is that we are literate about before we can continue thinking about where eco-literacy might fit into this. Aristotle, many, many years ago, argued that life in modern times is a little bit more complicated than we first imagined. This was over 2,000 years ago. The challenge I see here is that if Aristotle couldn't solve this, then probably the faculties of education today won't be able to solve this. So perhaps what we need is something like a pluralistic approach to thinking about the purposes of education. Dewey, a well-known educator who the Chinese saw as the second Confucius, argued that with education we should think in terms of education itself rather than in terms of some ism about education, even such an ism as progressivism, which is what he was known for. We'll come back to this later because I want you to keep hold of that notion of ism. We jump forward a little bit further into the 60s, just before I was born. Postman, writing as teaching as a subversive activity, reminded us that education is about crack detection. It's very easy to hear all sorts of messages, jump on bandwagons, be seduced into taking action to do certain things, and not use our critical faculties. Perhaps if you're an environmentalist, of course, we all know that waste can be reused. Perhaps it will be a fuel for other things. Perhaps we should hold on to that thought. Back to the UK, in the 1930s, there was such a thing as the Haddo Report. I am amazed by this simply because of the language used. This is supposed to be bureaucraties. You know, that kind of policy speak. This was an official government report. Do we recognise this? Is this how we talk about education? About it being humane, realistic, quickened by inquiry and experiment? Perhaps some other things which work as a prelude to eco-literacy are to think about these kinds of distinctions. That school is not equal to education. Christopher Jenks wrote a very powerful piece in the 60s and 70s around this notion. It has been disputed, of course, it's been contested, but one of the points that the evidence that he was looking at was trying to suggest from looking at inequality in the US was that we forget often all of the different things which go into making an education. We often too much focus on the school and the teacher, and we forget some of the other things which are there. John Hattie, from up the road, has spoken too about these kinds of things, and it puts our focus back onto the teacher. Whereas John Marsh has argued that if schools do not disproportionately improve or harm the life chances of their charges, why not free them to pursue other educational ends? I was told by my former colleague Hugh Lauder, 40% comes from home, 40% comes from school, and 20% you cannot say where it comes from. So if those are some of our initial thoughts, what might the eco-literate and the ecological have to do with all of this? Putting together the education, the environment and the sustainability of the title. Well, oikos is where the root term comes from the Greek. And we recognise it in things like economy and ecology. If you read David Orr's work, and again there are some suggestions where you might have a look on the back of that sheet, what David Orr argues is that given those kinds of thoughts about education and what education might be for, we might need to think about the languages of education, the places of education, the structures of education, the times of education, the economics of education, and the purposes of education. Now, I'm not going to go through all of those, but I hope to illustrate a few of those points throughout the rest of this presentation. If you've been to a science museum, you may have seen something like this. This is the life of the Earth compressed into a 24-hour clock. What did I learn from this? 2 seconds to midnight. It was never really about us, was it? Perhaps we need to decenter. Another way of putting this is through poetry. Some of you may know Carmel Point near Monterey in California, where Robertson Jeffers settled in the 30s. Read through the poem. We must uncentre our minds from ourselves. We must unhumanise our views a little and become confident as the rock and ocean that we were made from. Now, if you go to California, if you go to San Francisco, you will find that poem in a stretch of poems near the University of California. It's very powerful to be confronted by that. Well, my little toes just poking up there. That's one way of thinking about the ecological and the eco-literate. Another way is to start thinking about the economics. There are many studies like this. I can't guarantee the accuracy of these figures, but one of the things that Francis Whelan says is that we spend $3 trillion each year on education. I was reminded by a German colleague of mine that the amount of money which is spent on education for sustainable development in Germany, which is a very green country, amounts to less than 1 kilometre of autobahn per year. Now, one of the things which it says in the second paragraph of here is all education is environmental education. Who's got their numbers wrong? My children will make their presence known throughout this presentation. It's the privilege of doing a public lecture. You get to draw on your children a lot. Here's Lucy looking at a little bug. I like the fact that Robert Kennedy remarked the gross national product measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. Is it all about numbers? Is it all about what we spend? Some of you may know E.O. Wilson, known for the idea around biophilia. Here again we see a suggestion that perhaps we're missing the point. It's my son Tom at Phillip Island, looking towards Wonthaggi, caught up in a moment. Does he learn that in school? Where does he learn these things? The final part of my equation in my title was sustaining. What are we trying to sustain? Well, many of you will be familiar with this particular definition from Brundtland. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That isn't precise enough for some people. If you look at the Australian National Strategy for Ecological Sustainable Development, there is a concern that development is still there. Perhaps we should be thinking about other things. So the precision in that definition is to say conserving and enhancing the community's resources so that ecological processes on which life depends are maintained and the total quality of life now and in the future can be increased. But what does that look like in practice? Perhaps it's an end to violence. Perhaps it's a different way of living. Perhaps it's not about being a spectator. Perhaps it's about being a participant. Perhaps it's about making a change to the world you live in. If you go to the Australian Research Institute for Education for Sustainability, ARIES, I might not have got that quite right, you'll see this image. It's very white. It's very traditional. But there they discuss sustainability in terms of enough for everyone, forever. Perhaps another way of putting it is, amongst that network of people, whether they are family, extended family, broken family, whatever, who are those people? We don't know. We can read into certain things. But perhaps what sustainability, environment and education are about are learning to care for self, for others and planet. Another way of thinking about that is asking ourselves the question, what is it that we want for the world? What is the world we want? You've probably heard of Rio. We've probably heard of Johannesburg. We may know that we're coming towards the end of a decade of education for sustainable development sponsored by the UN. We also know that the Millennium Development Goals are about to finish. Well, what might we have as our agenda post that? If we look at education, there are some high hopes, as you can see in this particular quote. But it's also not that simple. Here are two other quotes from that report. We cannot continue to tell young people that they are the future if we don't provide them with the tools and resources they need to be successful in that future. And again, a challenge about the society in which we live. What is it that we are learning for? What is education for? Is it to tackle that kind of thing? Is it the silver bullet? Or do we need other things to consider? I like travelling. I also like reading. One of the things which I have read many, many times is about John Steinbeck. And one of the things which he says is, if a story is not about the hearer, he will not listen. 20 minutes in. And here I make a rule. A great and interesting story is about everyone, or it will not last. We may know Solano is in the food belt in California. He was writing East of Eden, Grapes of Wrath, all of those stories about the struggles of the poor. The Brundtland definition continues with the statement that development needs to tackle extreme poverty. Steinbeck's story are still living. This was taken last year. Here again we see the Mexican workers still struggling in the fields, knowing that they will be full of pesticides, there'll be higher cancer risks, and so on and so on. That's their story. What about my story? Where do I fit into all of this? This is sunny Ramsgate. This is the Regency Hotel. I am a love child. I was conceived in the Regency Hotel. I was soon adopted afterwards. My story continues to the left. There is St Augustine's Abbey. That is where I was christened with the name Dominic Bernard Christian Abra, a good Catholic name. This is the graveyard of that particular abbey. My grandparents, by blood, are buried just here. If my family have my way, I probably will be buried there too. That is the way things are. That is the story we live. If I wander around parts of Ramsgate, I will see things like this. It's hard work being human. Here's my lovely wife, Alex. That was then, about 5 years ago, before my hair went grey, before I decided that Movember was a style I should be adopting. I wonder where we'll end up. This was taken in Antibes, in the south of France. Is that what I aspire to? An Italian couple, the man with the courage to wear the Azzurri in his Speedos. Fantastic. Other parts of my story. The woman in the top left is a young girl there. It is my mother-in-law. I see her face and her features in my children. There she is, first 11 hockey. There's our house in Bath before we moved here, being built. There's me in a dress. Perhaps you didn't know that about me. That's the primary school my wife went to with 40 people. At one point, because there are 4 of them, they were 10% of the school. Here's my 2 boys when they're very young, inventing things. If you can look very carefully here, you'll see they're building a train track. There's a picture of a dinosaur here because they're going through Jurassic Park. Down over here is Grandpa playing the piano. There are certain affordances which come from leaving pianos around. There's Alaska, Anchorage, looking through from my hotel window to the mountains behind. And here is my own personal Jesus, Jesus Granados, who works for the Innovation Network for Global Universities in Barcelona, playing a proper game of football, I'll have you know. My story continues. This is in Point Reyes, or Point Reyes as the local call it. Again in California. Here are my 3 lovely children. I think about the generations. I think about the building behind, which asks me, where does hope come from? And then I'm reminded that this is my life. This is the library. Here are some of the books. David Orr's Earth in Mind, Environmental Education in Australia, books in other languages, all sorts of books to do with environmental education. These are the people I work with. If you look very carefully up there on the left in the light blue shirt, underneath the stone icon on the island of Veen is Alan Reid. And on the right, when Mark and I had the same dress code, is Mark Rickinson in that picture too. We had a visitor earlier this year, Paul Hart. That's Paul Hart and I doing some virtual kayaking. It's a bit cold in Alaska. Here are some of the faces of other environmental educators I work with from around the world, and so on. There are many, many. Here are some of the people who have shaped the way I think about the world. Steve Goff was my head of department. I'm so pleased he's not my head of department anymore. I didn't really say that. John Huckle, who is a eco-socialist by trade, a post-Marxist, neo-Marxist, we're never quite sure, but he has been one of the key advocates for a red approach to environmental education in the UK. Stephen Sterling, whose PhD thesis I had the privilege of reading many, many years ago, who talks all about systems thinking and holistic approaches. and Paul Vere, who makes a distinction between education for sustainable development type 1, which is where we learn about sustainability, and education for sustainable development type 2, where we actually do something about sustainability. Those are some of the people who, again, get woven into my life. What those people do, and what they stimulate me to do, is think about a few things. One of the dominant models in environmental education, which was developed in the 70s, was a very descriptive model to try and categorise what people see and do. I'm just going to play around with this a little bit, but what they do in these models is they talk about different types of environmental education. Education about the environment, education in the environment, education through the environment, education from the environment, education with the environment, education for the environment. All of those suggest different ways of organising learning and teaching, different forms of curriculum, different kinds of places, different kinds of purposes for education. But of course, what they don't always do is show that a model needs a reality. And in this particular reality, here's Lucy with one of her friends looking at a cowpat, wondering what's going on there. And what they get is an education of sorts about an environment of sorts. And again, it applies all the way through. Now, if these prepositions, the about, ins, throughs, froms, with and fors, are something which we can play around with, then perhaps we've got different dimensions to this kind of eco-literacy which is developing. Now, if we try to pull it together, perhaps what we're looking for is an iterative loop of all sorts of different things going on, as Tom is looking here at a pool of starfish or sea stars that he has been collecting. The other thing which any of you will know about me is I'm interested in how language works sometimes, or not. So sometimes we need to think about punctuation. Here's Tom Jonathan at the beach in Napier playing with some friends. They find a truck tyre on the beach. They know that it's covered in oil. They try to figure out what they can do with it. No adults around. What do? Well, they start wheeling it around. They try taking it to the person in charge of the beach. Can this be disposed of? It looks dangerous. All of those kinds of things. I look at pictures like that and I remind myself, perhaps that is a good education for this particular environment. Or this is a good environment for a certain type of education, giving someone an issue or a challenge or a problem to solve. Perhaps their interaction here, their participation, their perception of a problem will mean that that will help sustain this environment. Perhaps it might also sustain a certain type of education for them. Another way of looking at this is to think about the different shades of green. They're not quite 50, it's not quite 15, but we're nearly there. Some of us are aware of greenwashing, how easy it is to make things look green, in business particularly. Sometimes the people who are against light green like to adopt a deep green perspective. They might be ecosophers, deep ecologists. They might be people who like to believe in Gaia, for example. So there might be a deeper green approach. There might also be that red-green approach, which I'm not quite sure what colour that turns into if you mix those two together. But John Huckle is probably a good example of that. And John Feen in the 90s in Australia has also worked quite heavily with the red-green approach. A black-green approach is a relatively new term, but if you're interested in indigenous populations, First Nations and the like, then perhaps land rights or country or sea country, for example, might be something which brings in a black dimension. A grey-green approach might be the techno-fix. The dark green approach might be the dystopian view. If you think of The Road, if you've seen the movie or read the book, the post-apocalyptic version. Well, there might even be a blue-green approach. Perhaps it's turquoise, perhaps it's the Liberal government, perhaps there's no longer any green anymore with that kind of view. All of these suggest a couple of different things. If there are these different shades of green, then what we might need to do is think that There are some myths to be busted. Green plus education does not equal environmental education. There's a range of possibilities here. Also, an environmental education is not an environmentalist education. It may not necessarily be about putting someone's agenda into education. There are other possibilities. And again, there are a few others, but given time, I will skip. The main point, though, is can we live with the grain of nature in our education, in our society? Time to switch gears. Some of you are interested in this. When we talk about architecture, we think about the shape of our schools, the buildings, the different possibilities which are here. What I've done is just go to this website and pull out some different examples of schools which illustrate different approaches to turning the place of the school into a learning space for environmental and eco-literacy type initiatives. This particular one in Virginia was built to cure nature deficit disorder. Does that ring a bell? I wonder if my children suffer from nature deficit disorder. Perhaps they suffer from dad disorder. Perhaps he spends too much time dragging them up and down mountains and in and out of water and stuff like that. We'll see. There are some things there which I wonder about this place. This area here is new. It has this kind of studying in beanbags and sofas approach. Can we leave people to learn themselves in other groups? Another type of architecture for schools. This is the bamboo school, built in Bali. You have to pay a lot of money to go here, but perhaps this inspires us. Perhaps this kind of new architecture, new way of renewing the kind of buildings that we have, helps us think differently. Perhaps this is symbolic. Perhaps we could think differently about our curriculum. Is it made of concrete and steel and glass? Or could our curriculum be made out of bamboo? Could be renewable? A school in Spain which suffers from heat. What do we do about that? Again, simple design structures, perhaps more fitting to a city like Barcelona to design it this way. Using natural ventilation. How much do our air conditioning bills cost us? A school in China, not just a school, a community meeting place. A school in Vermont, a climate neutral building. In the Arctic Circle, it gets very, very cold there. Primary school in the UK. Perhaps, again, going back to my conversation with myself earlier, perhaps there are other things which are going on here when we think about how we design our education. Two more, one from Singapore. And then finally from Cambodia. The point is, there isn't one way of doing school. There's not one way of having buildings. There's not one way of being in an institution. Perhaps there is a natural diversity, a variety of approaches that we can take to these kinds of things. Back to my day job. I edit a journal called Environmental Education Research. Architecture does not fit into any category. I'm missing something. I'm also aware this is the colour and shape of some people's future. I think technically it's called diarrhea brown. It gives people the runs, the fear of where their future might go. So what might happen if we try and bring those two together? Well, my day job on Monday might be to review a paper like Mind the Gap. Why do people act environmentally and what are the barriers to pro-environmental behaviour? This is one of the most cited papers in the journal that I have the privilege of editing. But at the same time, I might be thinking of somewhere else. This is the stream in Kings Canyon near Muir Rock. Perhaps I'm thinking of an immersive form of education, not a paper-based one. And perhaps here with Tom and Jonathan and me just leaping out a picture, our way of honouring John Muir is to get stuck in, to experience things. It was really cold. Glacier fed. Another paper written by someone in the room, Mark Rickinson, Learners and Learning in Environmental Education, a critical review of the evidence. One thing that Mark forgot to include in his paper was fun. Do we learn through fun? Do we enjoy our learning? Is environmental education all about doom and gloom? Or is there hope? Are there other ways of thinking about things? Turn over to Wednesday. Education for Strategic Environmental Behaviour. Sounds good, doesn't it? Well, Louise Chawler has written very well about this, but sometimes a little modesty is required. I managed to keep my shorts on, the boys didn't. This is down at Wilson's prom. But again, experience counts. Understanding behaviour to understand behaviour change, a literature review. Again, something which environmental educators might be interested in. But again, my mind flips back to this kind of message I saw in Cal Academy of Sciences in 2010. What does that mean for equity, for economy, for environment, for ecology, for even eco-literacy? Day 5, the action competence approach in environmental education. This suggests that a focus on action and your ability to take action rather than prescribe action is important. Perhaps we've seen those messages. I am the solution. It's about me. What about we are the solution? Perhaps there are other things which could be going on. Perhaps because it's Friday, I might go out on Friday night. Any of you know Wilco? This owl keeps time with the music. A little sign there said, no fracking. Other things which you might see as spilling out of education. Starbucks no longer run this campaign, but isn't it interesting what they once put on some of their coffee cups? Well, this is my friend Jutta, one of my PhD students. She was not happy with the direction this lecture was taking. She wanted to see it go in a different direction. So she told me to make a shift again. She reminded me that the way I work quite often is linking things together. Not everybody sees the links, but perhaps they come afterwards. This is Mel. She is doing outdoor environmental ed at Bear Gully. You may have seen this image before. We used it for our Images of Education exhibition. She is changing perspective. Anyone know what one of these is? It's a solar oven. You can cook a roast on that. No energy required apart from the sun. Perhaps thinking about alternatives is one of the things which is important. Some of you may know this character. This is Phil Payne, living out of a sack. He goes to Bear Gully with all of his stuff in that bag. He does outdoor ed in a very minimalist way. Here are some of our students Not too sure what colours that person's wearing over there. I'm sure they're dodgy. But again, here, food which is bought from within 100 k's of the campus, all local and ecologically sourced, cheaper than going to a supermarket. Who would have thought? Cooked in groups. They didn't have to cook every single meal. Another way of doing this. Some of our other staff members. Here's Liz and Jade teaching on this. We are attired in ways which deliberately have no labels. If you do outdoor ed or environmental ed, sometimes what you wear becomes more important, the way you look. So we delabeled. Remember no logo? Naomi Klein? This is what we were doing. We also op-shopped our way there. Perhaps it's time for me to shut up a bit and let you read some quotes. These are from the Point Reyes Environmental Education Centre. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. This is Aldo Leopold's land ethic. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Steve Van Meter is the founder of Earth Education, in case you were wondering. And these are deliberately getting blurry because it's time to stop reading. Another 20 minutes is up. Time for another story. Steve Goff, who is no longer my head of department, once told me a fantastic story. He was talking about significant life experiences and why those are important. It starts with this pylon. His story goes something like this. He was asked by the librarian at Bath University to tell us something about local folklore. Bath is on the edge of Wiltshire and Somerset. Many of you will know Wiltshire as a place where things like Stonehenge is located. It has a rich history. He remembered something about electricity in his story, and he needed to think carefully as to why he was thinking about electricity. The answer came from crinoids. Some of you may know what a crinoid is. You'll find out in a while. Back to this particular pylon. The story goes that there used to be a holy well, a star well, somewhere near Chippenham where he grew up. The story was told to him by his father, and the electricity was some kind of connection in his memory with this holy well. When you go to this particular holy well, you will find, if you put your hand into the sand where the stream comes out of the rock, little stars. Those little stars are crinoids. Up until the 19th century, when we had a different worldview, they were obviously signs of divine blessing. Perhaps they are still, but in a different way. This is the well. This is my birth mother, who I now know very well and love very dearly. There's Lucy and Jonathan and me trying to find some stars. That story is now part of our story. We found that place. It is a significant life experience. It connects our generations together. That picture of my mother's hand is something now that all our children can share. And of course, I should show you some of those little stars. So if you'd like to pass that around, John. So stories might be really important for the ecological literacy and the ecological lives that we might lead. What I'm going to ask you to do now is change mode again. My story is nearly finished. What I'd like you to do is decide one thing every graduate should know. There are 7. Think of one.
Graduate of what?
Graduate of a university.
Any graduate.
Any graduate. Things every graduate should know. Just pick one thing. Give it some thought. Now, of course, deans, or even executive deans, know all the answers to these kinds of things, as do associate deans, because we spend a lot of time thinking about this. Now, what I'd like you to do is stand up. Because if I ask you to stick your hands up, very few of you will do this, so please all stand up. So, the 7 things every graduate should know come from this particular paper from the New Economics Foundation, which is a kind of left-leaning, also sustainability-oriented think tank in the UK. And they were asked to think about what a well-being focused approach to quality in higher education might look like, and then decide what that might turn into in terms of the things every graduate should know. So please stay standing if you can agree with this, and please raise your hand if this was one of the things you thought about.
Can I have the instruction again?
Please stay standing if you can agree that that's something that a graduate should know, and please raise your hand if that was the thing you thought of. Okay, one hand. Here's another one. Could you agree with that? If so, stay standing. If you thought of that one, please raise your hand. Okay, a couple of people for that one. How about this one? What makes a good life? Is that what every graduate should know? Please stay standing again if you think that is something which you could stand by. Raise your hand if that's something you thought of. Again, a few people. Thank you. Number 4, how others think. Okay. All work in environmental education. On that front row there, I notice. Thank you. A few more. Again, no one's sitting down. You can all see these might be things which graduates might know. About number 5. Okay, one hand up for that one. Again, no one's sitting down. You can agree with that one. The dynamics of power and influence. Okay, a few. And then finally, global interdependence. No one sitting down. There were clearly some other things you were thinking about. Perhaps when this finishes, you can talk to each other about what else you would add to that list. But just to remind you, that's the summary. Okay, you can all sit down now. Thank you. Okay, so those children, they get everywhere. Bridging. How do we bridge from that to the next part? Well, you can help your younger sister go across a stream. You might want to use other forms of transport. You might even build something permanent. But perhaps there's something else going on here again. If we can agree certain things about what every graduate should know, perhaps there are things we might need to think about in terms of what sustainable, literate, environmental aspects might be. Again, these were the questions which were written on the back of this sheet. I'm not going to go through all of these because you've got better things to do with your time, but you can see here some keywords which resonate with some of the things which were just mentioned. They come from the Dole report. This was a report on sustainable development in higher education, thinking about current practice and future developments. Monash University has an education for sustainability strategy. It's interesting to see how many of these things fit in with the work that Jeff Rose is leading here. What kinds of things constitute that kind of curriculum? Well, again, if you work with Stephen Sterling or Debbie Cotton down at the Centre for Sustainable Futures at Plymouth University, you'll recognise these are the kinds of concepts which students are encouraged to investigate, inquire about, not necessarily just learn. Again, working with Stephen Sterling, you get a sense that there are different types of pedagogies which are possible here. I don't think any of those scream out as controversial. I just still don't see fun. Not quite sure what's going on there. But again, often it's not rocket science. Perhaps it's just a shift, a reorientation from one thing to another. Why does this happen? Well, as you will have gathered by now, in my younger days, I started taking photos of things. You'll never guess what I took a photo of. What's happened there? There's a filter. I've been filtering things all the way through. Perhaps I need to start picking up the pace. Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts, says Rachel Carson, famous for Silent Spring. Do we contemplate that when we're in buildings like this? Do we find strength in buildings like this? Do we find beauty? It has to be a cliched photo. And another. Of course, this is coded. This is all about sex. My wife works as a nurse. New building. Where's the inspiration come from? Is that enough? Is that greenwash? Is this our lives? Which lives do we want? The world we want. Again, John Muir. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we'll find it hitched to everything else in the universe. You go to San Francisco, the UN Plaza, these are where these all come from. How about knowledge of the oceans? Perhaps we need to recognise that it can be about trade, it can be about experience, it can be about heritage. There are other aspects to the way we use our oceans. Again, the connections might be beginning to emerge. Perhaps we don't want to go the way of the dinosaurs. He's doing it again. He's linking, but we're lost. Where does this all take us? So, education and structures. Surely that's what a lecture on this should be about if we are to answer Alan's questions, which he asked us. Which tools, or perhaps our mental architecture is the better term, do we learn with? Which institutions do we associate with education? What do they bring to, add to and take from education? You get good at what you practice, not at what you don't. If we're doing it here, where else could we be doing it? Let's think about architecture for a few moments before I wrap this up. Ugly, imposing. Is that the curriculum? Is that education? Built by hippies in Denmark. Is that environmental education? Reusing old materials. Is that Alan's talk? Making good. Is that what education is for? Living in boxes. Is that what education is for? Glimpsing blue skies occasionally. Is that what education is for? Living in neat ways of thinking. Is that what education is for? Occupying education. Is that what education is for? Thinking differently about the everyday. Is that what education is for? Doing things differently. Is that what education is for? Seeing the power of the earth. Is that what education is for? Seeing certain things decay. Is that what education is for? Anyone recognise that building? Anyone recognise it now? Alcatraz. Is that what education is for? The bird's nest on top of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Is that what education is for? The way things are linked together. Is that what education is for? Your home is your mirror. Reflect your vision, reflect your values, reflect your passion. The earth is our collective home. Look within. Is that what education is for? Petroglyph Point. Looking at First Nations carvings, seeing how others understood that place. Is that what education is for? Going to Eureka. Is that what education is for? Thinking differently about the surfaces of things. Is that what education is for? Understanding cooperatives. Is that what education is for? Becoming a troglodyte. Is that what education is for? My children hate me sometimes. They wanted chickens. They had to source their own chicken materials. That's from the dump. That is an old dog kennel. Jonathan is having to build something for the chickens before they peck away at our garden. How do you understand eyes? How do you understand how a bike works? Do you get stuck in, or do you read it from a book? Is this where my hope lies? Is this what sustainability is all about? Is this an education for sustainability? I'll wrap up in a few minutes. Education for sustainability is an internationally recognised educational approach that moves beyond just imparting knowledge about the environment, education about sustainability, to building people's capacity for transformational change. Education for sustainability. It focuses on motivating and engaging people to help create a better future. Immersion. Building skills. Being able to do something else later. Enjoying things. Understanding the challenges. Seeing the art of education in earth. Yes, that's me. I am a tree hugger. what we think about and what we know in education doesn't have to be the way it is. That's what David Orr challenges us to think about. He encourages us to envision things differently, to use systems thinking, to think about things critically, to participate, but also to form partnerships. When someone asks me, what is education for? I think these things. Because we learn by doing, we learn by having fun, by getting out there, perhaps doing things a little bit differently. So to finish, thank you.